Hello and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today's conversation is going to be the first in a two-part series where we're going to be talking about overexploitation, and this is a conversation about what we're doing in terms of not using our resources sustainably. And so there's only a limited amount of stuff that's available to us, and that's what we want to talk about today. So here's a great quote. There's enough on this planet for everyone's needs, but not enough for everyone's greed. And that sort of goes to the idea that as our population gets larger, we're not going to be able to have the consumer cultures that we see now and still make our planet sustainable for future generations. And so when we talk about overexploitation, it's the use by us of a natural resource to the extent that it is not sustainable. And this is something that we definitely do. I mean, we like excess, we like big, we like to have lots of things. We're very much in lots of ways materialistic. And so that takes a toll on the environment around us. So when we talk about overexploitation, there are several reasons for that. And we've talking about them a little bit, but population growth is number one. I mean, we have a population that is 7 billion people and growing exponentially. Those people are starting to live in countries that are developing. So we talked earlier about the bulk of the population growth is going to be in the least developed countries, but even still, those countries are becoming more affluent, and over time, hopefully, will become industrialized, and when that happens, you're going to see more consumption, right? Because the more affluent societies consume a lot, right? And then there's a lack of education and incentives to change any unsustainable behaviors, and so there's no reason to not consume in most people's minds. And the other thing is that poverty is a huge pressure, and people always talk about, people tend to focus on the idea of overconsumption, but poverty actually plays as large or larger role in overexploitation, and that also is part of that lack of education and incentive to change unsustainable behaviors. But it's a different pressure. It's less about wanting to do something different and more about needing to do what they're doing. And so when we look at the relationship between land degradation and poverty, you can see that in the lowest developed nations, you are going to have these, yes, that's what I meant. In the lowest developing nations, you're going to see that when you have high poverty, and this is the least, the LDCs, you're going to have very little improvement in the land, and mostly you're going to have overusage, right? And stable land or slightly degraded, there's going to be a lot of it, but that is going to decrease over time, and the ratio is going to be a lot higher. So you've got this lots and lots of high degradation, and you have a little bit in the middle, and then you have these moderately, and a lot of this stable land is actually unusable, and so it's not something that we can actually exploit. And so it looks like there's lots and lots of stable land, but again, a lot of this is very marginal and just simply cannot be exploited. Whereas over here you can see that it's a lot more even, but the nice thing when you have low poverty is that you can go and fix a lot of the things that you've done, and that's pretty exciting too. Okay, so when we look at the poverty cycle and sustainability, the poverty cycle is that you are in poverty and you need to make money to feed your children, right, to have your family. And in order to make money, it is better to have more children. And if you have more children, then the population continues to grow. And a growing population puts huge pressures on the environment because you need to feed your family, right? And you need to exploit the resources so you can get money, so you can get food. And so you have this big circle that's a never-ending spiral of environmental degradation, population growth, and increasing poverty. And so there are a lot of things, there are a lot of issues that come with this poverty and this exploitation. And so when you have a larger population, you have to really exploit more land, and you have to turn wild habitat into usable land for the population. That leads to deforestation. Deforestation leads to flooding and erosion, and irrigation leads to salinization, because when you have water sitting on a field, it evaporates and it leaves the salt behind. And so you actually, by irrigating over irrigating, you actually can destroy the soil simply doing that. Also, in order to get more, you're going to have to use more fertilizers, you're going to have to use more pesticides, there's going to be more water diversion, there's going to be more water usage, and people are going to end up having to move to these clusters where they can all get together, they can have a community, and a lot of times these are shanty towns. And we will talk about slums and shanty towns and things like that later on. Now, when we talk about all of these pressures, that means that people's short-term needs are going to really supersede the protection of the environment, because it's very hard to say, well, I want to preserve this animal when you're starving. You know, I mean, the idea is that I can't think long-term about having a large population of these animals if I protect them. I need to eat today, right now. And so it's very difficult to convince people that they need to change their behaviors. And in some cases, you really can't convince them because they don't have any other options. And so the other thing that you're going to see is that fuel sources have to be cheap, and typically that's going to be biomass, which a lot of times is wood or manure slash dung, peat, things like that, and then coal is also a really, really cheap source. And so because you're using all of these cheap things, these immediate things, sustainable solutions do tend to be fairly expensive, and so you really see those in developed nations. Now, all of this leads to instability, right? And so you have starving populations, you have pressures, you have people can't meeting their needs, people who are not able to meet their needs. And so that often leads to governmental instability. It leads to conflict between groups. The actual degradation leads to a secondary loss of money, which is a loss of tourism, because nobody wants to go to a place that A, is unattractive, B, is governmentally unstable, or C, is at war, right? And so this is not a good thing. And you end up getting a lot of refugees, and unfortunately there's a lot of terrorist groups that come out of these very unstable areas. Okay, so let's talk about how these ideas have changed over time, like how our population and how our lifestyles have changed. And we've really got three big sections of human history, and that's the hunter-gatherer societies, and we've talked a lot about that. Now, a lot of people will say that, oh, the hunter-gatherers, they were completely in harmony with their environment and nature and blah, blah, blah. That's not necessarily true. We were definitely more a part of the natural system. We were subject to predation. We were predators. We couldn't mass consume anything. We were subject to the elements, right, disease. But it doesn't mean that we didn't have an impact. We colonized lots of new islands and areas in general, but especially islands, and we wiped out the ecosystems on them. And we are responsible for the extinction of the cave bear because we liked to live in caves. I mean, when people talk about caveman, a lot of times people think, oh, Neanderthal. But the group that actually settled permanently in caves was us, Homo sapiens. And right about the time that we started living in caves, the cave bear stopped living at all. Yeah, so there's that. Now, when we move to the agricultural societies, and by the way, this foraging keeps our population in check because we're only able to grow to as much food that we have, right? So in agricultural societies, though, you have this reliable food source, and so you can have a larger population. And then a larger population will actually settle down in these agricultural areas, and that requires land. And then you start having societies, and then civilizations and empires and things like that. And there have actually been a number of empires or civilizations that have been affected by changes in their geography. Rome, which had a lot of problems, by the way, towards the end of the empire there, but one of the big problems was that they had a small climate change that actually really decreased food production, and you already had this very unstable situation that was political and economic and social and all of these other things. But once you throw in the lack of food production, it really just all tumbles down. The Vikings actually also were pitched into a little bit of a dark age, and so they couldn't grow anything anymore, and so their society collapsed. The Mayans, right, which we're going to talk about very soon in a couple of days. And then the Anasazi, which we've already talked about, when there was the loss of water. And so you have this idea that societies are really dependent on their resources. I mean, that's just a fact. But we also have a tendency, because we sometimes are limited in our view, and if something is available, we kind of think that it will never run out, which is called the anthropocentric view, and that everything is really for us to consume. And so when you start thinking that way, that's when you start to do environmental damage. And so agricultural societies really start the beginning that was redundant. They're really the beginning of environmental damage. So industrial societies is where we go next. This is where we start having machinery and urbanization, and we actually start really, really exploiting resources because we can. We have larger populations, we can make more things, we've got mass production, and we've also got pollution, right? And that pollution is made worse, not just by usage, like an increase in usage, but also because we've got all of these toxic synthetics. We learn to make things that we want instead of having to collect them out of nature, and that's actually really useful, but sometimes that has really horrible health issues and environmental issues. And so we start realizing that we have to look at this myth of overabundance, that is there really an unlimited source of stuff, versus how can we manage resources? How can we be stewards of our environment and ensure that our population will actually continue and continue in an environment that is actually healthy and productive? Okay, so when we talk about exploited resources, these are really kind of the big things, and these are pretty much all the resources we use. But forests, really huge, and then plant and animal products, and those are the two things we're going to talk about today, by the way. We're going to talk about forests and plant and animal products. Land and water, which we've been talking about this whole time. We've been talking about agriculture. Fossil fuels and mineral resources, we're going to talk about a little bit later on. We start talking about industrialization, but these are all the things that we use frequently. And so like I said, we're going to focus on forests and plants and animal products today. Okay, so when we talk about loss of biodiversity, and forests, being organisms, would be included in that loss of biodiversity, there are a lot of reasons that you lose biodiversity, but you can really group them into a couple of categories. And the first one is habitat alteration, and this is the primary loss of biodiversity. And you can say habitat loss, habitat degradation, whatever, those all fall under this idea of habitat alteration, where you're changing it from the healthy natural ecosystem. The next thing that I want to talk about, which is actually the third largest problem. So we're going to focus today on the overexploitation. Overexploitation is the second most important reason for loss of biodiversity. And then competition with non-native or introduced or invasive species, you can say all of those things, that's actually going to be the third reason, because as these things move in because of changes we've made, or as things we bring in, they're actually going to compete with natural and the native flora and fauna in the ecosystem, and that really doesn't always go very well. And a really good example of that is killer bees. Another really good example is fire ants, and I think you're all probably familiar with those. Okay, so let's talk about forests, because when we talk about overexploitation of forests, we are really talking about habitat loss and habitat degradation, because we are, when we remove trees, not just removing specific organisms from an area, but we are actually destroying the base of this ecosystem. I mean, there's a reason that if you have a biome, it's called a tropical forest. It's because the trees are the thing that makes it the really, what it is. And so when we talk about our forests, we actually lose about 25% of the remaining forests each year. And most of that is to slash and burn agriculture, that shifting cultivation that is specific to these tropical forests. And then specialty timber, which are usually hardwoods, and that can range from oaks and hickories, which are nice hardwoods that are in temperate deciduous forests, to the really exotic woods that you find in the rainforests, like ebony and teak, rosewood, things like that. Now, there are really two things that you want to talk about. You want to talk about the forests in LDCs, and these are the ones that are being seriously overexploited. This is the slash and burn agriculture. This is the clear cutting for sale. But forests in MDCs in the most developed countries are typically managed, and the majority of forests are actually managed well, and they're sustainable. But because that's not always been true, you can actually see how the forests have changed over time. And in the United States, for instance, less than 10% of the old growth forests actually remain in the U.S. The majority of our trees, right, everything over 10%, has been logged, cut down entirely at least once, if not 2 or 3 times. And that includes the old hardwoods, right, and the ones that take 100 years to grow. And so we've actually cut that. The sad part of this is actually over half of what's remaining is scheduled currently for logging, because the majority of it is on public lands, and public lands are subject to both logging and drilling, right, drilling/mining. And so we'll talk about that later on. Now, the other thing that you see is that there are non-timber forest products, and there are these boutique products that increase degradation. And so these are going to be all of the rest of what you're talking about, any fruits or berries or leaves or whatever that are coming from the trees, as opposed to just the wood. And so this is also going to be problematic. Now, there's collateral damage that we talked about, and I really want to stress this. The collateral damage for the loss of forests is biodiversity loss and the loss of the services. The CO2 sink that we have, the oxygen production, because remember, oxygen production, the largest group that produces the largest amount of oxygen is going to be the phytoplankton in the ocean, but the second largest producer is going to be the tropical forests. And if we lose those, that's a huge loss of services. Okay, so when we look at estimated deforestation by the type of forest, you can see that, like I was telling you, we actually logged a lot of the temperate forests, and we really started to use those a lot, but we've started managing them. Unfortunately, though, the bulk of the big forests are gone now, but what we've got left we actually manage. But then if you look at tropical forests, they're still really experiencing huge losses, although it's better than it has been in the past, and there are things like debt for nature swaps. Developed countries can convince developing nations to set aside land, and sometimes the government of the developed nation will forgive debts from that country, or will give them extra money, as we give other governments money and things like that. And so that debt for nature swap actually turns out to be particularly helpful in these areas. Okay, and then when we look at the overall changes in forest area, the bottom line here is that the majority of forest loss is occurring in the tropical rainforest, and this is where it's going to be the most problematic, and these are the forests that are actually hardest to grow back. If you look at all the other forests, they actually grow back fairly well, and then when you start managing them, that works out quite nicely. But when you talk about the tropical rainforest, you really have a very hard time restoring those back to forest, because it's such a complex ecosystem and the soil is so terribly nutrient poor. So that's a huge, huge issue. Okay, so now let's talk about overexploitation of the actual biodiversity itself, aside from the trees. So when we talk about that, the big part there is going to be commercial hunting. And so overexploitation of plant and animal products is going to be hunting, whether you're hunting for commercially or hunting for food. You're also going to include the pet trade, right? And then there's this other group that's killed because of superstition. And what this really talks about is folk medicine, fear, right? But mostly folk medicine, treatments, religious ceremonies, and fear. Those are the big things. But that's a lot of animals being killed for a lot of times just plain old ignorance. Okay, so, right, when this is the stuff that we've talked about already, but I just wanted you to see that when we talk about overexploitation specifically of the biosphere, we're talking about living off of the plant and animal products. We use them for food, medicine, shelter, fiber, and any other products, okay? Remember, it's the second most important threat to the survival of plants and animals, and then it's actually one of the 3 most important threats to freshwater fish. Freshwater fish actually also have the pollution issue, so water diversion, which is habitat loss for them, and pollution, which is habitat degradation for them, are going to be huge there. Okay. The other thing too is that usually when we're exploiting a species, we're looking at one or two species, but a lot of non-target species are affected as well, because if you kill an animal's prey, right, or if you collect all of the certain type of plant in the ecosystem, you're going to affect the entire trophic web, the entire food web. Okay, so let's start with hunting, which is also poaching when it's illegal, and collection. And when we talk about that, we're talking about food, number one, in LDCs. Also, your products, that's going to include things like fur and ivory, horn, bone, skin, folk medicines, ornamental, like landscaping plants, things like that, and then pet trade, and then also for sport, people just like to hunt. Okay, so when we talk about hunting, unfortunately, we have a history of hunting things to extinction, and we kind of start with the cave bear and sort of go from there. You might have heard of the auk or the dodo or things like that. They're pretty famous. But the auroch was something that we talked about earlier, because remember, this is the progenitor of the cow, and it's been extinct since 1627 because it was hunted so severely that by the 1500s there were only 38, less than 40 of these animals remaining. And so by the time you get there, you're past the critical number, and so you really can't get these populations to grow healthily, because you've lost the genetic diversity that you need. All right, and then let's move to the fur trade, though, because the fur trade is something that you're going to see in MDCs, right, a lot. And so you have these animals, and there'll be a trend every season, and or several seasons, and when those animals start to become scarce, then you move on to a new season, and then you have those last season furs, and eventually, as those animals hopefully come back, they'll become the new thing, the new it fur. And so synthetic furs are actually a really nice thing, because when you start looking at the fur trade, people often think, oh, that's going to be raised for fur. And in case of mink and foxes, oftentimes they actually are raised for fur. You do have these mink and fox farms. You also have nutria farms, by the way, which is how we got nutria as an invasive species in Texas, just as an aside. But a lot of these things are actually going to be trapped or shot in the wild, and so some of your big famous victims are going to be all of the spotted and striped cats. Everybody loves tigers and cheetahs and leopards and jaguars and all of these things. And typically they only use the belly fur on these guys because it's the softest, and so the rest of it is just left for whatever. Otters, really, really popular, and then seals and sea lions are always really popular. And so when you look at this typical 40-inch fur coat, when you can pick any of these are all very common furs that are used. You can see the number of target animals, and a lot of times you're going to have a lot of animals because they're either small or you're just using a specific part, like I was saying, the belly fur for lynx and tigers and stuff like that. And then the other category is the number of trash animals, and trash animals are animals that inadvertently get killed because of the traps or the poisons or the hunting or whatever. And so when you start looking at the total cost in terms of animal life for these coats, it becomes tremendously expensive. All right, so we not only like to have fur, but we also like feathers, and a very the poster case for the extinction of something for, fashion would be the passenger pigeon. And here is actually Martha. This is the last passenger pigeon that we know of. And she died in 1914. And here's an example of a passenger pigeon on a lady's hat. And so in the late 1800s, this was all the thing. And if you did not have a passenger pigeon hat, you were just not part of the in-group. And so everybody wanted a passenger pigeon hat. And the really sad thing is that these are very social birds, and they would flock together, and so you could kill vast numbers of them at a single time, and that's exactly what people did. They would go out and they would slaughter 50, 60, 100 at a time, and so it was very quick from the fashion to the extinction. And then, of course, we like to have skins. We like leather, and leather actually works out to be sustainable in terms of biodiversity loss. It's not sustainable because it's cattle, and cattle frequently are not sustainable overall. But by the same token, you are using the leather and the meat and everything else. But these By the way, this is Fashion Week from 2012 right here. This is crocodile, right? You've got a crocodile, you've got snake, right? A little snake skin here, a little snake skin here. And it's not, this is ostrich, by the way. And most of these animals are actually not used for anything else. They're simply caught or raised for their skins. And there are all sorts of faux skins nowadays, and that might be a better solution, especially when you're talking about these really large K-selected species. And then the products, when we're talking about jewelry, decor. So we've been talking a little bit about clothes, but we also like to have things. And these are actual ivory piano keys because they used to be, that's why it's called tickling the ivories, because they used to be ivory. Here's a lovely ivory piece. This is made of bone, right? In a lot of cases when you get these big pieces, they're actually pressed bone dust, but bone nonetheless. Here is the famous bearskin rug. And then this is something that was popular in the colonial times when days of Britain, right, colonizing Africa. This is an elephant foot umbrella stand. And you cannot actually have these anymore because they're highly endangered. But this is one of the reasons that they're endangered. Actually, this right here and that right there. And then the pet trade is huge, right? And for those of you that have seen Finding Nemo, there is the wild capture of marine fish. And the pet trade is actually huge, huge money. It is right behind drugs on the black market. And so when you're buying all these animals, it's about $15 billion a year on the black market. And in between 2003 and 2005, there were an estimated 210 million animals imported to the U.S., some legal, some not so legal. But if you want to check it out, when you look at the PowerPoint, this is a link to some of the lists of animals that were imported. The majority of these are all wild caught, and then when you break down the numbers, this is from 2006. This is a lot of animals. All right, and the most common things you're going to see, and you can see all of these in pet stores. You can go to the pet store right now and buy the majority of these things, especially your exotic birds, fish. Almost all of your tropical fish, 75% of your tropical fish are actually wild caught. Any of the non-human primates, this is going to be your lemurs, actually your sugar gliders, your bush babies, things like that. Prairie dogs in certain areas are pets, even though they're endangered. Although anymore, it's hard to get a prairie dog legally, so there's that. And then reptiles, tons of reptiles. And I'd also like to point out that reptiles carry all sorts of things, right? All sorts of germs. And salmonella happens to be one of them. And there are 74,000 cases in the last 10 years of people getting salmonella from their reptile pets. So there's one more reason not to have reptiles. And then your small mammals, all of these things, chinchillas, hedgehogs, guinea pigs, they're wild-caught guinea pigs, and so there you go. And then, of course, probably the most controversial and the animals that you really don't want to have are going to be your big cats, your tigers, your cougars, and your wolves. The other thing that you're going to find a lot, and this is less in the United States and more everywhere else, are apes. Right? All of the great apes are, for whatever reason, kept as pets, and they, number one, make terrible pets, and number two, are all endangered, and so it's not a good thing. All right. Also, let's talk about your folk medicine and your homeopathic remedies. So wild plants and animals in LDCs are used for all kinds of things. And sadly, when you start using some of these, the rest of the animal is not used. And a lot of these animals are endangered when you're looking at tigers and rhinoceros. These really kind of big, powerful animals are used a lot in aphrodisiacs, and those are very, very popular and very, very hard to get people to stop taking. And then in MDCs, what you have are those homeopathic remedies, and these are going to be mostly herbal, but a lot of this stuff is wild collected, and you go to the store and you buy it, and you don't really know what it is or what it's for, really, or what the side effects are, but that's typically what happens in the MDCs. Now, there's also the fisheries. You want to think about, and this is a food thing, but everybody around the world, more or less, eats some sort of fish product. And you can see that there are countries that eat more fish, there are countries that eat less fish, but almost everybody's going to eat some sort of fish. And so when you look at fish supply and you look at fish usage, we have demanded more and more and more of our fish, right? And so we are eating more and more and more as the population goes up, and we've actually are eating more now than the population has increased. And so what that says is that more people are adding more fish to their diet, and this is unsustainable. And the bulk of the world's fisheries actually are either overexploited, threatened, or near or at max capacity for fishing, right? And so when we look at that, you can actually see that the wild capture is decreasing, and that's simply because there's less fish out there. And this includes other seafood like crabs and shrimp and lobsters and all. Although the lobster fishery is quite healthy, so there's that. But one of the things that's really helping take pressure off of wild fisheries is aquaculture. And aquaculture is the farming of fish, and it can be very, very successful. And so fortunately, we'll be able to hopefully fish wild less and eat farmed more. All right, so where does this all go? When you put this picture together of overexploitation, you have the potential for catastrophe. I mean, huge devastation and collapse and all of these things. And probably the best example of this is Easter Island. And you may know Easter Island because of the big statues, the big god statues that are on there of the local gods. But this island was actually settled around 1600 years ago. It's not very big, but when it was settled, it actually was covered entirely with forests. And the people that came there cleared the forest for agriculture. They used the wood to build boats because they were a fishing society, and they built their houses. And by the mid-1400s, about 200 years later, there were somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people living on this little island. And they had so exploited the soil, it was nutrient poor. They had fished all of the seas around them. They had actually depleted, because they lost all the trees, all of the natural native biodiversity. So there's no more birds, there's none of that. And so they were raising rats in captivity for food. And so, yes, kids, it's another rat dinner. Not exciting. And then the soil, actually, not only was it nutrient poor, but it started to erode completely away. And so nothing was growing. And so they actually built all of those stone statues that you now see on this barren, desolate island. They built these to have the gods bring their trees back, and it did not work. And by 1550, all of the resources were gone. Okay, and the government collapsed. You had these tribal wars over what little resources were left. And then, instead of figuring out some way to work together and, have things come back, these groups actually started setting fires around their areas. And these fires just swept through the island and really killed off anything that was left. And so at this point, you've got all the resources are depleted. And there is this period where they resort to cannibalism. And that never is a good thing. And then, of course, everybody leaves or dies. So, and now it's not occupied. So, one of the things that we have to think about when we're talking about agriculture and when we're talking about industrialization and urbanization and all of these things is, how do we learn from the mistakes in the past, and how do we move forward in lifestyles that we are comfortable with but that are also sustainable, and how do MDCs help LDCs move into these more industrialized phases without really just pillaging their environment? So that's what we're going to be thinking about. And if you have any questions about anything that I've talked about just now, please make sure that you ask in class, and I will see you next time.